Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Thank you to those of you joining us from the East, and good morning to those joining us from the West. Thank you for coming to this webinar on World Tsunami Awareness Day for the showcase of the 2025 edition of the Tsunami Emergency Planning in Australia Handbook. The theme for World Tsunami Awareness Day 2025 is Be Tsunami Ready, Invest in Tsunami Preparedness. My name is Isabel Corns, Senior Project Officer in the Knowledge Development Team at AIDR, and I'm delighted to be your host for this webinar. I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from which you are all joining us today, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respect to elders, past and present, and acknowledge the tens of thousands of years that Indigenous people have cared for the land, the waters, and the animals of this country. I'd like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes. Today's event will be recorded and made available on the AIDR Knowledge Hub, along with the presentation slides after the event. Today we'll be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A box, not into the chat window. You'll be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I'll do my best to ask a number of these to our speakers towards the end. I encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations. You'll just need to select the All Panelists and Attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to be able to view your messages. A kind reminder to please be respectful to each other and to our presenters when posting your comments or questions. Please be aware that some of the content we discuss may be distressing or bring up prior experiences. Please use the techniques that you have developed to help you manage any adverse reactions. So I have recently had the pleasure of managing the review of the Tsunami Emergency Planning in Australia Handbook with the support of the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group and a wonderful working group of experts. I'm grateful to have 4 of these experts joining us here today. Tsunamis are not a hazard we hear talked about very often in the Australian context. However, Australia is surrounded to the north and east by some 8,000 kilometres of active tectonic plate boundaries capable of generating a tsunami that could reach Australia within 2 to 4 hours. We also have other plate boundaries across the Pacific Basin, such as the South American subduction zone, and an event from there could also generate tsunamis that would reach Australia in 14 to 18 hours. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander oral history and geological evidence does show us, though, that Australia has had some significant inundation and tsunami events in the past. So while rare, it's definitely a hazard we need to be planning and preparing for. To talk us through some of the key updates to the 2025 edition of the Handbook is our first speaker, Handbook writer and wearer of many, many hats, David Parsons ESM. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. First slide, please, Isabel. It's going to cover four quick topics with you this afternoon. A little bit about the handbook, a little bit about Australia's history in terms of the tsunami risk, what's changed in this handbook compared to previous editions and what's been added, and last of all, from my mindset anyway, what are some of the challenges for us in managing tsunami risk after having done this actual project. Isabel, next slide, please. First of all, say how these handbooks are created is you get an expert group on the line, and they give you hundreds of comments, and we were very careful this time to include not only the expert advisory group, but people from local government who have to develop local plans, and our colleagues from over the ditch over in New Zealand who also helped us with this project, so thank you. And one of the challenges with this project is there's a lot of science in the front end of the book, and trying to get that balance between the scientific knowledge to understand the tsunami risk, as well as the useful practical guides for planners who are trying to implement measures to respond to and recover from a tsunami risk. So there's always a bit of a challenge getting that balance right. Next slide, please, Isabel. One of the awakenings for me in doing this project and reading the work that was sent in and the contribution from the specialists and from colleagues around the world was just the vast number of tsunamis that not only the world has, but of course we have here in Australia if you dig back through our past years both of written history and the oral history that precedes that written history, and you start realizing how many tsunamis have occurred in this country. And in fact, the research shows we've had people washed out to sea. We've lost boats, with all sorts of things, and you start to realize just how real the risk is. And then the photograph there from Clontarf Beach here over in New South Wales, the tsunami that came from Chile in 1960, and in the right hand there you can see a news clipping, but it also talks about a pilot in Vic down in our southern state, down in the Victorian area, watching a beach disappear as the tsunami hit. So when you start looking, there's lots of history around the tsunami events. Next slide, please, Isabel. So what's the significant changes and those additions to the current handbook? The handbook was restructured into a PPRR context, so the data was resorted into matching that. There's increased information about the tsunami record and of the history, including some quotation or some knowledge that we've been able to bring across in the handbook about our First Nations people and their experience with tsunamis going back over thousands of years. So we've got a couple of case studies that are written up into the handbook. The tsunami risk, that is the front end of the book, that helps us understand what the tsunami risk is, has had quite a few changes to it. And of course, one of the learnings for me was that we're still understanding more and more about tsunami risk and the different causes of tsunamis and how those different causes can affect how that tsunami spreads around the risk area. We've imported some sections about the natural systems that nature had in place to reduce the risk in terms of coastal foreshores and plants, and then of all the mangroves, etc. So it's a section on that in there. Then in terms of preparation, all of the modelling, you'll see some of this shortly in some of the presentations, some of the great modelling tools that are there now to better understand what the risk is. And when we do these handbooks, we link them to other handbooks. So there's the Emergency Planning Handbook, there's the Recovery Handbook, there's the Warnings Handbook, etc. So rather than having great sections on that, it often just refers back to those handbooks. And also a section around communities and engaging with our communities. And you'll read some research in there in the handbook that was done a couple of years back now, just showing that the community doesn't really have a mindset or a hearing to want to hear about some of these risks, that other things in their mind. And tsunamis doesn't necessarily dominate in people's mindsets. In the response section, a bit more about warnings this time than in previous ones, and the introduction of the Australian warning system. Now, some states and territories have started using the Australian warning system for the tsunami risk, and there's other states haven't. So that's one of those changes that's currently happening right around us as we speak. And we're also talking there too about the different methodologies that different locations use to issue warnings, from drones flying along the coastline and other things. We've updated the section on response to include the changes at a national level, so the national situation rooms in this current handbook. And then in the recovery section, there's a page there of the different consequences that we can expect to see in a tsunami event. And this actually came from our colleagues in New Zealand, who already had an existing document, and we held a workshop in New Zealand to generate additional content for that. So I thank my Kiwi colleagues for that. And last of all, the catastrophic disaster management. So Natural Hazards Research Australia has released a document on this, and we did reference that document and some learnings from that document into the handbook. And I would say, for those who maybe aren't aware, our colleagues in New Zealand have a catastrophic handbook to manage catastrophic events that came out just a few months ago. If you haven't seen that, it's well worth downloading that from the National Emergency Management Agency in New Zealand, looking at catastrophic events, and of course, in their case, planning for tsunamis that will kill tens of thousands of people. But it's a great handbook to find. Next page, please. Having done the handbook, that is, pulled together all those ideas from those knowledge specialists and melding it into the handbook, a few things have stuck in my mind that I think are important challenges in terms of risk management for the tsunami risk. And that is, here in Australia, we have a beach culture. And maybe our worst case scenario is on one of those really hot days when there's hundreds of thousands on the beach and our tsunami event happens. And that beach culture means that we have people living right on the coastline. That means we can have hundreds of thousands of people on the beach lines on a busy day. That community interest in understanding tsunami risk isn't high. And so we've got a starting point of a community who probably don't really believe the risk is relevant to them. We've got a community on the coastline that can be quite transient in terms of people that are on holidays and tourists, etc. And that just makes that far more challenging, as our coastlines and our beaches are the centre of our country in terms of population and population visits. The maritime community, whether it's the people sailing or big ships or small ships or boating or canoeing, all those sorts of things, and kayaking along the coastline, how do we communicate risk with those sorts of users is just another challenge. And in Fukushima, certainly the owners of fishing vessels knew what to do, because that is part of their culture, is to know that when there's an earthquake, you take your fishing vessel out of the port straight away. So challenges there, having communication methods with that maritime sector in all its different forms. The communication of risk, as I said, there's the Australian warning system is being used by some people. How would you communicate risk and get the right reaction from people is another question, I think. And we've seen in past events here in Australia where there's a tsunami warning and people drive to the coastline to see what's going on. So again, the community action doesn't necessarily match what we want to see, because our understanding of the risk in Australia is just so poor amongst the general person that's in the street. So how do we get the right sort of reaction, I think, is a challenge for us. And that's the right sort of reaction against populations that include tourists, locals, water users, and not just coastal water users up in river systems. As when you look at the case studies, you'll see that we've had tsunamis travel 20 kilometres inland more than once. And so all those sorts of challenges. And I think the last one there is there's no doubt in my mind that an effective tsunami response to a tsunami warning is an all-agency event. It's not just, say, for example, my own state, where it's the State Emergency Services in New South Wales, it's surf lifesaving, it's police, it's national parks who own coastline areas, it's local council. It needs to be very much all stakeholders, whereas the maritime sector, every person who can communicate the message, who can get action taken. And I think that's a real challenge for us, is ensuring we have that highly integrated stakeholder response to get the best outcome, so we have no one washed out to sea, no one loses their life. So I think, having done this project, those are some of the key issues, I think, for anybody planning to the response to a tsunami, is how you tackle all those challenges. Thanks very much. There's some great presentations to follow, and you'll see some of the things covered in the handbook pop out in those presentations. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, David, for that summary of the changes to this updated version of the handbook. Now we're going to dive into some of the science behind tsunamis. So please join me in welcoming our second speaker for today, Associate Professor Hannah Power. Hannah Power is an Associate Professor of Coastal and Marine Science at the University of Newcastle, Australia. And as a coastal morphologist and geologist, Hannah has worked on coastlines in Australia and around the world. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Isabel, and thank you for having me today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of tsunami in Australia, some critical events from historic and more recent times, some key concepts that we can take away from them and how they support tsunami science, and then some sort of key learnings for management. Next slide. So just as a reminder for a sort of tsunami 101, the majority of tsunami are generated by submarine earthquakes at subduction zones where two tectonic plates are colliding. They kind of jam and stick together, and then they rupture, and that rupture generates a massive movement of the whole of the water column above the sea floor, which radiates outwards as a wave. This accounts for about 2/3 to 3/4 of tsunami that we have good records for. And then the majority of the remaining tsunami are generated by underwater volcanic eruptions, underwater landslides, some combination of earthquake, volcano, and landslide, and meteorological events. You can see on this map here the distribution of where tsunami are generated from around the world. And for Australia, probably the key takeaway from this is that our main sources in terms of where we're likely to experience a tsunami from are from the northern regions, so to the northwest of Australia and the northeast of Australia, and then to the east of Australia along those subduction zones around New Zealand. Now, Australia's reasonably lucky when it comes to tsunami. As David said, we don't have a huge risk here. It does often lead to people becoming complacent. But one of the reasons we don't have a huge risk is because we're situated at a relative distance from all of our major subduction zones. So we're likely to have a reasonable length of warning time for any subduction zone generated tsunami. Next slide. So David already touched on this, and independently, we've both picked this photo of Clontarf to include in our slides. The Chile 1960 event was the largest recorded earthquake in our records and created a tsunami that traveled all the way across the Pacific, causing deaths in Japan and Hawaii. At Cronulla, there was a 1.37 metre wave recorded. You can see a little news article about that from CSIRO Fisheries that was there. And we saw pretty significant events. Clontarf is 5 kilometres upstream in Sydney Harbour, and this tsunami event generated a very large whirlpool at this point. For those of you familiar in Sydney, this photo is just downstream of the Spit Bridge. And we're actually able to replicate this whirlpool that forms at this particular location in Middle Harbour in our tsunami modelling when we replicate this event. Now, one of the key takeaways from this is that even though we might have a smaller wave or something that isn't particularly large in terms of its onshore impacts, we can still see significant coastal erosion occurring that has the potential to cause significant loss of life. Next slide. More recently, we had the Tohoku 2011 event, which of course was catastrophic in Japan. In Australia, the effects were more limited. We had waves observed along the east coast all the way down to Tasmania, and unusual currents were noted in Port Kembla and Sydney Harbour. In terms of impacts to people, several swimmers were washed into a lagoon at Merimbula, which was one of the main sort of events in terms of impacts to people. But that's an example of how even a small impact can cause significant potential for loss of life. Next slide. Even more recently, we had the Hunga Tonga Hunga Ha'apai event in 2002. This was generated by a large underwater volcanic eruption that disrupted the seafloor above it. Now, one of the challenges with managing tsunami warnings in Australia is that the system is primarily monitoring for submarine earthquakes, so those earthquakes that are generated at subduction zones, and that's because that's the majority of our sources for our tsunami. However, in this instance, that's not what generated this tsunami. It was that underwater volcano, and that led to a tsunami warning being put out. You can see that Bureau of Meteorology threat map shown there in the top right, and you can see that marine warnings were put out for the east coast from sort of Fraser Island all the way down to the bottom of Tasmania, including Lord Howe and Norfolk Island. Norfolk Island, being closest to the event, experienced the largest wave. Lord Howe Island, in this instance, there was an evacuation warning for low-lying lands, and significant waves were recorded up and down the east coast. Next slide, please. So in Australia, one of the key hazard assessments we have is our probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment. This was originally completed in 2008 at Geoscience Australia. And the two key things to take away from this are, one, that it's probabilistic. So for each of our locations around the coast, we can get a probability associated with a wave of a certain size. So for example, what is the size of a tsunami wave that might hit offshore of Sydney once every 100 years on average? So it's really useful in terms of being able to fully understand our risk in terms of the likelihood of events. The other key thing about this probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment is that it's informed by events. And it was updated in 2018 following the 2011 Tohoku event. And that was because prior to that 2011 event, scientists weren't aware of the size of earthquake that could be generated from a subduction zone of that length. And so as we experience more events, we're able to better understand and improve our science and therefore improve our hazard assessment. The challenge here is that the really high magnitude or very infrequent events, we have very limited historic records. So even though it was catastrophic, an event like the Tohoku event is very valuable in terms of informing our science. Another point to note here is that the probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment for Australia only includes subduction zone earthquake sources. Next slide. For Australia, this is a space where I've done a little bit of work. We also have a bit of a risk from submarine landslide hazards. Now, for this kind of hazard, we don't have anywhere near as much data as we have for subduction zone earthquake tsunami. And so we tend to do event-based modelling where we use historic landslide scars or potential slides. And you can see from these maps here that show the outlines of several shapes off the coast of New South Wales. These represent the submarine landslide scars and potential landslides that we can map off the coast. There's a whole lot of slides off there. Some of them are potentially tsunamigenic and some of them are historic, so they've happened in the past. But in this space, we have a lot of uncertainty around triggering mechanisms, rates of failure, so how quickly do these slides fail, the type of failure, do they go in little sections or do they go all at once, and the recurrence interval, so how frequently they occur. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some of that modelling. You can see in the sort of centre right a shot of what the seafloor looks like. This is the Byron slide off the coast of Byron Bay, and it looks like someone's taken an ice cream scoop out of the edge of our continent. These slides are really large. They're several kilometres wide, several kilometres long, several hundred metres of thick of sediment that's been removed from the shelf. And it's that movement of the sediment down the slope that generates the wave. Next slide, please. So regardless of whether we're looking at a subduction zone earthquake generated tsunami, a submarine landslide generated tsunami, or a volcanic driven event, what can the science do? Well, the science can bring the offshore to onshore. So here we've got an example of some work that myself and some colleagues did mapping the Sunshine Coast slide and the potential impacts to southeast Queensland. And some of the key takeaways that we can get from this are the arrival times from the initiation of tsunami. And one point to make here is that for our local submarine landslide generated sources, those arrival times are really short. We're talking 10 to 30 minutes. We can extract out things like the maximum wave amplitude, the maximum current speeds, and inundation areas. And this same concept applies to modelling other tsunami sources, whether it's an earthquake generated or a volcanic generated. Next slide. So looking in really closely from a sort of emergency management perspective, what we're able to do is look at individual maps of inundation extents. Here you can see inundation extents for a couple of locations around the Sunshine Coast region, and those different coloured areas represent different inundation depths. And we're able to take some key learnings from these things. So we're able to look at things like the fact that estuary entrances and upstream areas are often particularly more vulnerable than the open coast. And that's because estuaries tend to funnel tsunami energy and focus it. We can also see in the sort of northern extent of panel B there that there's some focusing occurring around that little offshore island. So some of these things, even though we're doing site-specific modelling here, we can get some takeaways that could be applied generically. Next slide, please. And of course, even though this event that we're modelling here has relatively limited inundation extent, we see that if we look at the water velocities, we see a really concerning picture. So we see that currents can be a really significant hazard for marine threat events, even when you might think, oh, well, it's not a land threat, it's not going to be a massive issue. And those really significant currents can drive localised erosion, and they can be really significant from a hazard perspective. One caveat I would add to this is that when we do tsunami modelling, typically we're not modelling the movement of any sediment. So for example, here you can see in panel A at the bottom, Bribie Island is particularly inundated, and I'm well aware that Bribie Island isn't quite that same shape anymore. But those changes to our soft sediment features, our sand islands, our beaches, might actually result in increased inundation behind these features as a result of significant erosion that we know can occur during tsunami events. Next slide, please. So what are the takeaways? Well, most tsunami, but not all, are generated by subduction zone earthquakes, and depending on where you are, other generation mechanisms are really important to consider. The science is constantly evolving as new events occur, and Tohoku was critical in our understanding of earthquake-generated tsunami. Australia has a probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment for subduction zone earthquake tsunami, and this is a really invaluable resource. It's a fabulous thing that we have in this country. Other tsunami sources remain critically understudied, and we don't really have a very good handle on what the risk to Australia is from submarine landslide generated tsunami or volcanic generated tsunami. Onshore modelling of hazard provides key parameters to inform emergency management, and I know that Jane and Adrian will speak more on this in their talks. And case study learnings can be really useful for unstudied sites or sources because we can take those generic learnings and apply them to places where we don't have detailed modelling. Next slide, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that really clear dive into the science behind tsunami. Our
Thanks,
third
Isabel.
speaker for today, Dr. Jane Sexton, will build on this to give us some insights into the emergency management context. As Director in the State Operations Directorate at the Queensland Fire Department, Jane leads a branch that applies intelligence, predictions, and planning to reduce disaster risk and enhance community safety. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, and for setting the scene, both to Hannah and David before me. So how I'm going to tackle this today is to try and give a short history tour of tsunami emergency management in Australia and how it's been influenced and shaped, shaped by the events that have occurred over the nearly 21-year window since 2004, but also how fundamental the science has been to enabling emergency management. I also want to touch on the global nature of this hazard and how we benefit from the international engagement through the warning systems in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. But also I want to make a point of calling out the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group, or INSARAG, which sets the benchmarks for the USAR capability that's been deployed to help with the assistance for tsunami events worldwide. Next slide, please. So the key messages I want to try and cover today really is the continual message here of learning from events. Only by learning from events are we going to have continuous improvement in our systems. The emergency management system as a whole has advanced through the world-class science that's been conducted by our leading science agencies and research institutions, both here in Australia and overseas. That science and emergency management continues to evolve as we observe more events, as Hannah has also outlined already to us today. Emergency management is grounded in a risk-based approach in line with our national and international strategies and frameworks so that we are prepared for the next event. And David also talked at length about this, the continuing challenges of public awareness with low frequency, high consequence events, and why days like today are so very important. Next slide, please. So let's start with the 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami. We all know the devastating consequences that this event had, but it's hard to believe that it took this event for Australia to commit to the establishment of the Australian Tsunami Warning System. But before the warning system was even in place, there was Australia's response to that event. Australia's assistance included the dispatch of fire officers to Indonesia, then later to Sri Lanka and the Maldives to provide logistical support to medical teams deployed to deal with the aftermath of the devastating tsunami. You'll put the pictures up, please. The New South Wales Fire Brigade, as it was known at the time, received praise nationally and internationally for its ability to rapidly deploy food, water, shelter, sanitation and power for those missions overseas. And they were the only non-military agency with the capability to rapidly coordinate and manage the required logistical support to enable those sustainable operations of those medical teams. Perhaps many people think about warning systems as simply the detection, the alerting and the warning functions delivered by our national science agencies of Geoscience Australia and the Bureau of Meteorology. But of course, it's so much more than that. It's the emergency management practices that need to be established, including the handbooks, as what we're talking about here today, the guidelines that support them, the hazard plans that exist across the country, the evacuation mapping and planning, the exercising, the training and education, and of course the community education and awareness. And of course, these practices are informed by the science of tsunami and the original 2008 probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment was absolutely pivotal in setting off the original inundation modelling around the country and helping to set up the scenario catalogue that is still part and parcel of the warning system that we have here today. Next slide, please. And this is where the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group, or ATAG, comes in. Originally called the Australian Tsunami Working Group, it brought together every state and territory emergency services agency, the Bureau, Geoscience Australia and EMA, as it was at the time. The group started work and developed the first handbook, and the one that we're talking about today is now the third. It was we designed and delivered the Introduction to Tsunami for Emergency Managers program when we published the ultimate guide that Isabel has put in the chat there for any of you who'd like to go and have a look at that. Over the years, the group has continued to refine warning procedures, update handbooks, integrate new information and share data and knowledge, particularly from our colleagues from over the ditch in New Zealand. The work that Adrian will talk about next has been informed by the experiences in New Zealand and which we are now starting to apply across the whole country. The membership of that group has expanded significantly since 2004. It now includes all Australian offshore territories and the state science departments who provide advice at our jurisdictional level. The group has also been connected in with the tsunami program in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And in the case of the Indian Ocean, Australia played a major role in establishing the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System. And noting that this presentation is about the whole of emergency management, it's also remiss of me not to also call out the important work undertaken by our INTERAG classified disaster assistance and response teams, both here in Queensland and New South Wales, who have been deployed overseas to help our neighbours recover from tsunami events. But all of this work that's been conducted by ATAG to build this Australian tsunami warning system has all been grounded in the science that Hannah has outlined today. So my part of this webinar is really to talk about how those tsunami events have impacted emergency management. But I also want to call out how science itself has also been impacted by the events. Next slide, please. Now, Hannah's really already covered this one, but really, all scientific models continue to evolve through observations. And for tsunami, these observations don't come around all that often. But a really important one is the Tohoku event, as Hannah has already talked us through. But what it did was question the assumptions on how big earthquakes can be on different parts of the subduction zones around the world. This new information was integrated into the 2018 probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment, which has been a crucial input to the work that Adrian will present next. Next slide, please. But now returning to that question about how tsunami events have impacted emergency management. And I'll start with this event that happened not long after the Indian Ocean devastating event in 2004, but instead we've got this small one in 2006. Well, it was small for Australia. And many of us on the East Coast probably are not even aware of this particular event. It ran up in a small part of the coast in Western Australia. And it left the scene that you can see there at the top. It's a campsite that was completely run over by the tsunami, and it moved that four-wheel drive that you can see there several metres inland. And by all accounts too, there was a mum holding her bub hanging onto the bull bar of that particular car. Now, what's important for this event from an emergency management perspective is that particular event reached a point of 10 metres high, or the run-up height, that's the elevation above AHD that the tsunami reached. Now, it turns out, and no one's really quite sure about this, but our rule of thumb that we use for evacuation mapping around the country is to use 1 kilometre inland and 10 metres up. So in some ways, this provides us an evidence base by using that particular example to inform our evacuation mapping before we have all the very detailed inundation modelling that we are now fortunate to have in many parts of Australia. Next slide, please. Now we move to 2007, and there was an event at Solomon Islands. Again, this event happened before we actually had the warning system in place. So it did take us quite a number of years to have an operational warning system. And now this event led to large evacuation in Cairns because we really had no knowledge about what to expect from an event here. But there were many who thought that any event that was going to come towards North Queensland would simply be protected by the reef. So this event helped us in the sense of being able to dispel myths, by being able to say quite clearly that this reef really it didn't stop the tsunami, as many might be led to believe, but some further work that was done after that event tells us that the arrival time was delayed, the amplitude of the tsunami wave height was somewhat reduced, but clearly that tsunami was still able to propagate through the reef and be observed on the coastal side of that reef. Next slide, please. Now, when we move to the Tohoku event, I'm going to use this one as an opportunity to do a call out to Jeremy Stubbs from Fire and Rescue in New South Wales, who was able to dig these images out from the archives there, to note that Australia sent quite a large force to Japan to help in the recovery efforts post the 2011 event. So this shows the global collaboration in disaster management and how these events provide learning opportunities that our responders can then in turn return home with. Next slide, please. Okay, so this next one that'll be in more recent memory, of course, will be the volcanic eruption, just to the east of us near Tonga. Now, this particular event led to the exercise Bombora. Some of you may have heard about this, but it was a national catastrophic exercise that was jointly delivered by QFIS at the time, New South Wales SES and NEMA. And this was developed in the wake of that particular event. And so the reason really for that was to consider, well, what would a catastrophic event look like? And how would we as a nation be able to respond to something of that order? Now, just reflecting back on the revised 2018 PTHA, this work is informed by what we understand to be the maximum size earthquake that we could anticipate occurring to our east on that part of the trench. So yeah, this one, it will certainly cause some major evacuation for most parts of the eastern seaboard, but also of interest will be and for Australia's response to our friends in New Zealand. As Hannah also sort of alluded to, is that we know a lot more about tsunamis generated by earthquakes than we do by any other source. And we've been very fortunate as a group from ATAG to be able to submit a concept into the Natural Hazards Research Australia so that we can conduct some research so we can understand what the tsunami risk to Australia is from these volcanic sources. We need to be in a position to understand whether or not that 2022 event, if it was to happen again, could it be bigger? And so then we can understand what the risk is, and so that we can start to be prepared for the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so all of these practices are based around our understanding of risk. And of course, we know that this is pretty hard given that tsunami is a low frequency event and we've got a very short observational period. But this is where the PTHA has been super important, plus our engagement through our colleagues in the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System, the Pacific, on the global scale with the UN and as well with INSARAG. But now we have experienced tsunami generated by earthquake and volcanic eruptions, and we know there's historical precedent for submarine landslides, as Hannah has already shown us, and this is something that we need to be prepared for. So at this point, I'll do a shout out to the Sunshine Coast Disaster Management Group, who embraced the research that Hannah has put forward and conducted a district exercise last year so that they can be prepared if there was to be a submarine landslide off their coastline. So next slide, please. So really just to thank you again for listening. Post on LinkedIn and use the hashtags and remember that the risk of tsunami is higher in countries that we love to travel to. So we love to go to the beach, not just in Australia, but also in other places around the world. And you've got to know how to get away from tsunami, what to do in those times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I'm so glad we got the microphone to work for Jane's excellent presentation. Our final speaker will now present a case study on how all of this science and the emergency management context is informing evacuation maps in Western Australia to ensure that the community is better prepared. Adrian Brannigan has 10 years of emergency management experience and is the project lead for the Western Australia Tsunami Inundation Modelling Project. Over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, Isabel. And also thanks to David, Hannah and Jane, who provided a really nice introduction to the work that I'm doing, particularly focusing on the probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment and also the historical events. So before we start talking about tsunamis in Western Australia, I just want to point out the work that we do here in Western Australia is very much team efforts. So first of all, we've got a partnership with Geoscience Australia and the Department of Fire and Emergency Services in Western Australia, who I work for. So really appreciative of all the work that Gareth and Matthew and Dylan do. And in DFES, there's a team of people behind me that are helping me, and so you see them listed here, also together with the local knowledge from DFES regional staff and also local government. So they provide that sort of local on-the-ground feedback to the tsunami evacuation maps, which we're very appreciative of. Next slide, please. So in case it's not really, aware of this already, why should we study tsunami? So first of all, tsunami is the world's deadliest hazard. So the UN Head points out that in the past 100 years, 58 tsunamis have claimed more than 260,000 lives globally, averaging 4,600 per event, which surpasses any other natural hazard. So on the right-hand side here, on the bottom right, you've got a simulation from the 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami. And you've got some impacts of that tsunami internationally shown there. Next slide. So that same event in 2004 actually impacted Perth. So more than 100 people required rescuing near Perth. And then if we look at the historical record since 1838, we can see that WA experiences a tsunami on average once every 10 years. So perhaps a bit more frequent that people are aware of. Jane nicely touched on the Steep Point event from 2006, which is shown on the right there. Next slide, please. So DFES has got a legislative responsibility to prevent, prepare, respond and recover. And also under the State Hazard Plan Tsunami has a responsibility to undertake tsunami inundation or flooding modelling and mapping, and also participating in local and regional planning. Next slide, please. So noting this risk and noting the legislative responsibility of DFES to do something about it, the West Australian Tsunami Inundation Modelling Project was born. So the aim of this project is really to develop science-informed evacuation maps to ensure that WA communities are better prepared. So it's ultimately about using the science to reduce the risk. Next slide, please. So it's worthwhile having a look at what was our knowledge of tsunami before the project began in 2021. So on the right here, you've got the Probabilistic Tsunami Hazard Assessment, or PTHA 2018. This is developed by Geoscience Australia. And what you can see here is the offshore earthquake-generated tsunami hazard for Australia. And the critical piece that I want you to focus on is the northwest of WA, which has got Australia's highest offshore hazard. Critically, there are no detailed tsunami evacuation maps available. Next slide, please. So what information will we receive in the event of a tsunami? So tsunamis are warned nationally by the Joint Australian Tsunami Warning Centre. This is a combination of Geoscience Australia and the Bureau of Meteorology. Following an earthquake being detected, within half an hour, the Warning Centre will issue a National Tsunami Watch, which really means to stand by further information. And the next one. And then within an hour of the earthquake, the Warning Centre will issue watches and warnings to affected states and territories. Next slide, please. So what would an event for Perth possibly look like? So I'm going to present you with a bit of a scenario here, which provides a bit of the context from which we're sort of working from. So the Joint Australian Tsunami Warning Centre issues a tsunami land warning for the metropolitan regions due to an earthquake near the south coast of Indonesia. It's worthwhile pointing out the south coast of Indonesia is the primary source site for earthquake-generated tsunamis in WA. Following this warning, in the mainland metro regions, DFES as little as 2 hours and 30 minutes before marine impacts and 3 hours before land inundation, with dangerous waves lasting more than a day. Next slide, please. So the existing or the current land threat advice, this is the advice that existed since 2008, so well before the project began. The current advice is to go 10 metres up or 1 kilometre inland. Now that's shown on the right-hand image there in the yellow for the Perth area. It's important that the handbook describes this as a rule of thumb, and additionally the handbook points out that detailed inundation or flooding modelling is required to determine which communities require evacuation. Using this rule of thumb in the Perth metro area, this would require the evacuation of at least 100,000 estimated residents, plus additional people, including workers, tourists at the beach, people in the coastal entertainment areas, 22 schools, 15 nursing retirement homes, and 1 public hospital. So you've got a significant amount of people, and also a significant amount of facilities for vulnerable people, which are going to require complex evacuation. Next slide, please. So the work that we're doing is undertaking modelling from the southwest of WA, which is our most populated part of the state, up to northwest WA, where the offshore hazard is the greatest. So what we're doing is we're taking that offshore hazard and then we're bringing it onshore to see what areas of the land are going to be flooded. This is developing Australia's most extensive tsunami evacuation maps, which are informed by high-resolution modelling. Next slide, please. So how did Geoscience Australia model that onshore hazard? So in the Probabilistic Tsunami Hazard Assessment 2018, there's over 130,000 earthquake tsunami scenarios near the south coast of Indonesia, the primary source site for WA. Next slide, please. So it's impossible for, with the current computing power, to model all those scenarios. So Geoscience Australia randomly samples 390 of those scenarios and then runs 24-hour simulations from the earthquake source near the south coast of Indonesia to the flooding of the land. And from that, we get a range of products, including depth, flow speed, arrival time, and wave time series. And next one, please. Those 390 models are then combined, and from there we can determine the frequency of inundation. So we can look at a particular piece of land and say, what's the likelihood of this piece of land being flooded? And so whether that piece of land is your home, or whether it's an aged care facility, whether it's hospital, we can determine what that likelihood is. Also, we can get uncertainties with that as well. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the model and how we use the modeling outputs to build tsunami evacuation maps, and then compare the proposed evacuation zones with the existing rule of thumb. So I want you to focus your attention on the left. So this is an image of Fremantle. So Fremantle is an area in Perth. There's port facilities, there's a lot of tourist facilities, residential workers, a wide range of land users. And this image shows the likelihood of Fremantle being flooded by tsunami. I want to focus your attention on the yellow image on that left yellow polygon on the left-hand image. So that's the area that's likely to be inundated by the 1 in 2,500 year tsunami. This is the criteria that New Zealand and Italy uses to develop their tsunami evacuation maps. Now you can see that yellow image on the left-hand side. That's a very complex image, not very effective for warnings. And so to enable clear communication, what we then do, if we're looking at the the middle image there, we then move that yellow shape inland, and there is a road. So the key piece of information here is that if you want to be safe, basically move to the east, to the right of the main road that should go through Fremantle South Terrace. So you can see that the yellow zone, and looking at the middle image, the yellow zone is the science-informed tsunami evacuation zone, and outside of that, you've got the green zone, which is the safe zone. So that's that middle image there, the yellow is the science-informed evacuation zone. Now what we're going to do is compare that same zone with the existing rule of thumb. So I want you to look at the right-hand image. So in the right-hand image, you've got that yellow science-informed evacuation zone. The grey shows the existing rule of thumb, the existing land warning advice. That's the 10 metres up and 1 kilometre inland. So once you have a look at a bit of a comparison, what do you see? Well, first of all, you can see there's a significant reduction in the land area between the science-informed evacuation zone shown in yellow and the existing rule of thumb shown in grey. Next slide, please. Now, if we compare the proposed and existing evacuation zones, we see there's at least an 80% reduction in people and facilities for vulnerable people in the metro area. So if we look at the proposed science-informed evacuation zone, there's less than 20,000 residents, whereas the existing rule of thumb has got 5 times more with over 100,000. Under this proposed science-informed zone, there's only 2 schools, whereas the existing rule of thumb has got 22 schools. Under the proposed, there's 3 nursing retirement homes, whereas the existing has got 15. And critically, there's no public hospitals in the proposed evacuation zone, but there's 1 under the existing. So why does this matter? Well, things like nursing and retirement homes, public hospitals, they're very difficult to evacuate, and they could easily suck up a lot of resources for some facilities that may not even be in the hazard zone in the first place. Next slide, please. So if the proposed science-informed evacuation zone would be implemented, it would reduce the risks due to over-evacuation. So it enabled DFES to prioritise and warn a longer stretch of the coastline with current systems. It will reduce extra people to manage during an evacuation, and it would enable more targeted communications and planning for those in the evacuation zone. Next slide, please. Next steps. So first of all, it's to raise awareness of these evacuation maps within DFES, to put them onto DFES's operational mapping viewer. Following that, broadcasting the evacuation maps to the public through integrating them to our DFES's public-facing warning website, Emergency WA. The development of Tsunami Awareness products, you can see a selection of these on the right-hand side there. A communication strategy for tsunami, next slide please. Integrating mitigation activities into land use planning, so providing inundation modelling products to inform land use planning, undertaking exercises at the local, district and state level, and also develop recommendations for plans and procedures. So updating plans, policies, procedures, and embedding mapping updates into business processes. Critically, the recommendations of plans and procedures are partly based on the response actions outlined in the handbook. Next slide, please. Thanks for your time, and here is a selection of some of our further information that if you'd like further information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. We're running a little bit tight on time today, but I do note that Hannah has responded to at least one of the questions in the Q&A, and we will look to getting those other questions answered for you by our speakers after this webinar, and that will go up on the website when we upload the recording of the webinar from today. So thank you so much. Thank you to David, Hannah, Jane, and Adrian for speaking with us today. A big thank you to the Australian Tsunami Advisory Group for their support with the handbook review, and to Charlotte Fell and Angela Draper for making this webinar possible. I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support of the National Emergency Management Agency in bringing this important resource to the fore. Our next webinar will be the 5th for the Resilience Matters series on the ethical premise of disaster management leadership with Mark Crosweller on the 12th of November. The registration link is in the chat and on the screen. When you leave this call, you'll be taken to a short survey. We will use this information to ensure that our professional development events program continues to meet your needs. On behalf of AIDR, thank you so much for joining us today on World Tsunami Awareness Day. It's been my absolute pleasure to host you, and until next time, stay safe and go well.